Before the United States became a symbol of freedom, it was a land of erased voices. Before the first flag was raised, lives were broken in silence. This story does not begin with victory. It begins with loss. We are taught a version of America that starts with courage and ends with greatness. But buried beneath that story is another one, a darker one, a story of land already taken, people already living, and promises already broken. Tonight, we are not here to celebrate history. We are here to confront, because you cannot understand America's power until you understand what was destroyed to create it. We'll explain everything in this video step by step. Don't skip it. Before there was a flag, before there was a promise, before there was even a name, there was land, vast, ancient, and alive. Forests breathed where cities would rise. Rivers carved their own laws through soil untouched by maps. And on this land lived nations, hundreds of them, speaking different languages, practicing different faiths, carrying stories older than Europe itself. They were not waiting to be discovered. They were already home. But history, as it often does, arrived not as a guest, but as a storm. In the early 1600s, wooden ships cut through the Atlantic, carrying men and women who believed they were chosen by God, chosen by destiny, chosen to claim. They came with Bibles in their hands and fear in their hearts, fear of hunger, fear of the unknown, fear of becoming nothing in a crowded old world that had no room left for them. And so they convinced themselves that this land was empty, that its people were savages, that taking was the same as surviving. This was the first lie America told itself. The earliest colonies were not born of freedom, but of desperation, hierarchy, and profit. Jamestown, often remembered as the nation's first permanent English settlement, was not a town of idealists. It was a business venture. Investors wanted returns. The land was expected to produce wealth, not equality. When survival failed, violence filled the gap. Native alliances turned into wars. Treaties became tools of delay. Promises were made not to be kept, but to be broken later, more conveniently. And as land was seized, labor became the next question. In 1619, a ship arrived in Virginia carrying something that would shape the nation's soul forever. More than 20 African men and women were sold, not as servants, not as neighbors, but as property. No law yet named it slavery, but the logic was already there. Human beings were reduced to assets. Skin became destiny. Chains became policy. Over time, this cruelty hardened into structure, then into law, then into tradition. And the nation learned quietly, efficiently how to live with its own brutality. As colonies grew, so did a dangerous contradiction. Men spoke of liberty while owning other men. They demanded freedom from kings while ruling over slaves. They wrote sermons about the soul while selling bodies at auction. This contradiction did not weaken America. It powered it. Tobacco, rice, cotton, industries soaked in forced labor, funded cities, universities, and fortunes. Northern merchants insured slave ships. Southern planters justified bondage with scripture. The economy grew, the conscience shrank. By the late 1700s, rebellion filled the air. The colonists, tired of British taxes and distant authority, began to speak a new language: rights, liberty, self-rule. And in 1776, they wrote words so beautiful that the world still quotes them. All men are created equal. But the ink dried in rooms where enslaved people served the meals. The words echoed across fields where chains still clanked. This was not hypocrisy by accident. It was compromise by design. The Constitution that followed was not a perfect union. It was a fragile bargain. To hold the states together, human beings were counted as fractions. Slavery was protected, delayed, disguised in legal language. The founders knew what they were doing. They chose unity over justice, stability over truth. They hoped future generations would fix what they could not or would not. And so the nation was born not innocent, but unfinished. Expansion followed independence like a shadow. The land hunger returned. Now draped in the language of destiny, native nations were pushed westward through treaties signed under threat and broken without apology. Families were forced to walk until their bodies gave out. Children died on roads that would later be called progress. This suffering was not hidden. It was justified because America told itself another story, that growth was divine, that power was proof of righteousness. Yet even in the darkness, resistance never stopped. Enslaved people ran, rebelled, prayed, and endured. Native nations fought, adapted, and survived. Women demanded voices in a system built without them. The story of America is not only about cruelty, it is also about courage born under pressure. But courage does not erase the past. It confronts it. To remember America's origins honestly is not to hate the nation. It is to respect it enough to tell the truth. The United States was not born pure. It was born conflicted. It was born struggling between its highest ideals and its deepest fears. And that struggle between who we say we are and who we have been has never ended. History does not ask us to feel shame. It asks us to feel responsibility, because a nation that forgets its origins risks repeating them, and a nation that faces them may finally become what it promised. Not perfect, but honest. Not innocent, but accountable. And perhaps, at last, worthy of its own words. Long before maps learned the shape of this continent, before borders hardened into ink and law, the land that would later be called the United States was already full of meaning. Not empty, not silent, not waiting. It carried memory in its rivers and instructions in its seasons. Forests grew according to rhythms learned over centuries. Plains fed animals that fed people. Mountains were not obstacles but ancestors. This land did not belong to anyone in the modern sense. It was lived with, listened to, negotiated with, and on it lived nations, hundreds of them, distinct, sovereign, and enduring. They were farmers and hunters, traders and astronomers, builders and storytellers. Some lived in vast cities with roads, governance, and architecture that astonished the first Europeans who saw them and then quickly forgot what they had seen. Others lived in mobile societies shaped by migration and ceremony rather than walls. They spoke languages as complex as any spoken in Europe. They carried laws not written on paper, but remembered with care. Time for them was not a line marching forward toward conquest, but a circle that bound the living to the dead and the unborn. When Europeans arrived, they did not enter a wilderness. They entered relationships, already in motion. Trade networks stretched from the Great Lakes to the Gulf. Diplomacy governed alliances and rivalries. Land was not a commodity to be owned outright, but a responsibility shared across generations. These societies had survived droughts, wars, migrations, and collapse long before a single European ship crossed the Atlantic. They were not fragile. They were not lost. They were not lesser. But the newcomers arrived carrying a different imagination. In Europe, land meant power. Ownership meant security. And history had taught them that survival belonged to those who took first and justified later. So when they looked at a continent shaped by peoples who did not fence it the way they did, they decided it must be unused. When they encountered nations who lived differently, they decided they must be inferior. This was not ignorance alone, it was strategy. Calling the land empty made it easier to claim. Calling its people savage made it easier to remove them. And so one of the most enduring myths in American history was born, that civilization arrived where nothing of value existed before. This myth would be repeated in sermons, journals, laws, and school books. It would become so familiar that it would feel like truth, and over time, it would erase not only lives, but memory itself. Early encounters were not immediately defined by conquest. There were moments of cooperation, mutual aid, and shared survival. Europeans depended on native knowledge to live through unfamiliar winters, to grow crops, to navigate rivers and terrain. Without native guidance, many settlements would have failed entirely. But dependence bred fear, and fear bred resentment. Gratitude gave way to entitlement. The balance shifted. As populations grew, the hunger for land intensified. Fields expanded, forests fell, animals vanished. Where treaties were signed, they were often misunderstood by design. Words like sale and ownership did not mean the same thing across cultures, and those differences were exploited. Agreements were honored, only extraction deepened, then discarded once they became inconvenient. Violence followed paperwork. Removal followed violence. What was taken was not just land, but structure. Sacred sites were desecrated. Food systems collapsed. Communities were fractured. Disease, carried unknowingly or indifferently, tore through villages at a pace no war ever could. Entire nations vanished in a generation, not because they were weak, but because they were exposed to forces that did not see them as human equals. And still, resistance persisted. Some nations fought, others negotiated, others adapted, absorbing new tools and ideas while trying to preserve their core. They were not passive victims of history, they were active participants in a struggle they did not choose. But the scale of power was uneven, and the story that would later be told favored the winners. As the colonies grew into a nation, the original inhabitants of the land were pushed further into the margins of the national story. They became symbols rather than people, obstacles rather than neighbors, footnotes rather than founders. Their presence contradicted the idea of a new beginning, and so it was minimized, then denied. Textbooks would later describe a westward movement as if it were a natural force, like weather, rather than a deliberate series of decisions. Pioneers, woe, old, be celebrated without mention of those displaced to make room for them. The land would be described as discovered, settled, civilized. Rarely would it be described as taken. Even the language reveals the intent. Frontier suggests emptiness. Settlement suggests peace. Expansion suggests growth without cost. But behind each of these words lies a quieter truth. Someone else was already there, and they were made to leave. The irony is that the American relationship with the land, so often praised as rugged and independent, was built by rejecting the very knowledge that had sustained it for thousands of years. Indigenous practices of agriculture, controlled burning, and ecological balance were dismissed as primitive, only to be rediscovered centuries later under different names. The wisdom was never lost. It was ignored. To understand the origins of the United States honestly is to begin not with ships landing on distant shores, but with civilizations already rooted in the soil. It is to acknowledge that the American story did not begin with freedom seekers, but with encounters between worlds that did not meet as equals. One side believed land could be owned absolutely, the other believed land could only be respected. One side measured success by accumulation, the other by continuity. The tragedy is not that these worlds were different, but that one decided it had the right to erase the other. What remains today are fragments, names of rivers and states, borrowed words, scattered traditions, living nations still fighting for recognition. Despite centuries of removal, suppression, and forced assimilation, Native communities endure. Their survival is itself a challenge to the myth of disappearance. The land remembers even when people forget. Trails remain beneath highways, burial grounds lie beneath cities, stories survive in languages still spoken quietly, defiantly. The idea that America began on empty ground was never true, but it was useful. ND usefulness in history often matters more than truth. To look back at this beginning is uncomfortable because it strips away innocence. It asks us to see the nation not as a miracle that appeared fully formed, but as a place built on choices, some courageous, many cruel. It reminds us that origin stories are not neutral. They are written by those who benefit from them. And if the land was already alive before the nation arrived, then the nation did not inherit a blank page. It inherited a responsibility it has never fully acknowledged, a debt written not in numbers but in absence, in silenced voices, in histories pushed aside so that another story could stand taller, a story that begins by pretending nothing stood there at all. They did not cross the ocean driven only by hope. They crossed it carrying fear, fear of poverty, fear of religious persecution, fear of disappearing into the lower ranks of a rigid European world that had already decided who mattered and who did not. Many of them believed they were fleeing tyranny, but they were also fleeing insignificance. The New World, as they called it, offered something rare, the possibility of becoming chosen. Faith gave that possibility language. For many settlers, God was not simply a source of comfort. God was an explanation, a justification, a witness who could be invoked to make unbearable actions feel necessary, even righteous. When crops failed, it was a test. When natives resisted, it was a threat from the devil. When violence occurred, it was framed as defense of God's will rather than the pursuit of power. They read Scripture not as a call to humility, but as a map. Stories of ancient Israel conquering Promi. Said lands were absorbed deeply, not as metaphor, but as precedent. If God had once cleared land for his chosen people, then surely he could do so again. And if suffering followed, it only proved the purity of the mission. This belief did not make settlers cruel overnight. It made cruelty survivable. The wilderness terrified them. Forests felt endless. The silence felt hostile. They came from villages shaped by church bells and walls, and suddenly they were surrounded by land that did not respond to prayer the way they expected. Every shadow carried uncertainty. Every unfamiliar sound suggested danger. Faith became a way to impose order on chaos. But fear has a way of narrowing vision. Rather than seeing native peoples as neighbors shaped by the same human needs, settlers increasingly saw them as obstacles placed in the path of destiny. Differences in dress, worship, and land use were interpreted not as cultural variation, but as moral failure. A people who did not worship the same God in the same way could be described as godless. A people who did not fence land could be accused of wasting it. These judgments were not incidental, they were essential. The first lie was simple but powerful. That domination was the same as obedience to God. Once this idea took hold, nearly anything could be justified. Land seizure became stewardship. Broken treaties became divine correction. Violence became purification. Faith was no longer a private belief system. It became a political weapon, shaping laws, borders, and futures. Yet even within these religious communities, contradictions pulsed beneath the surface. Sermons preached charity while communities practiced exclusion. Ministers warned against pride while declaring moral superiority over entire civilizations. The language of salvation was used to erase, not redeem. Some settlers genuinely believed conversion could replace conquest. They spoke of saving souls even as they destroyed societies. Children were taken from families to be educated in European ways, their languages beaten out of them, their identities reframed as sins. The intention, they claimed, was mercy. The result was loss so deep it echoed across generations. Fear amplified faith's darker impulses. Fear of being overwhelmed, fear of retaliation, fear of becoming what they despised. As populations grew and competition for resources intensified, settlers increasingly interpreted resistance as proof of native savagery rather than a rational response to invasion. Each act of defense by native communities was folded into a story of perpetual threat. That story spread quickly because it was useful. It united settlers across class lines. It transformed personal insecurity into collective purpose. It allowed communities to see themselves as victims even while expanding relentlessly. Fear, once sanctified, became contagious. This mindset also shaped how settlers viewed themselves. They began to imagine their survival as miraculous, their success as evidence of divine favor. Hardship became proof of worthiness. Prosperity became confirmation. Failure, when it occurred, was blamed on insufficient faith or moral weakness, not flawed assumptions. Over time, this moral framework hardened into identity. To question expansion was to question God. To sympathize with native resistance was to betray the community. Faith became less about spiritual reflection and more about social enforcement. Yet beneath the confidence ran anxiety. Many settlers worried that their claim to righteousness was fragile. They feared that without constant assertion it might collapse. And so they repeated the lie again and again until it felt ancient, unquestionable. This dynamic did not end with the earliest colonies. It evolved. The language shifted, but the structure remained. Divine will became manifest destiny. Sacred mission became national purpose. God's blessing became progress itself. What began as religious justification transformed into cultural assumption. The first lie, that God had cleared the land for those bold enough to take it, allowed a society to avoid moral reckoning. It turned theft into inheritance. It transformed fear into virtue. It made forgetting not just possible, but necessary. And like all powerful lies, it carried consequences beyond its original intent. It taught generations to confuse belief with entitlement. It trained a nation to see opposition as evil rather than human. It narrowed the moral imagination until compassion itself became suspect. There were dissenters even then. Some voices warned that faith twisted into conquest would hollow the soul. A few missionaries recorded the humanity they witnessed, the grief they caused. Some settlers questioned whether survival required domination, but these voices were quiet, easily dismissed as naive or disloyal. The dominant narrative prevailed because it offered certainty in a frightening world. It replaced doubt with destiny. It gave meaning to suffering by assigning blame elsewhere. It assured people that whatever they took, they deserved. And so faith, which might have offered humility before the vastness of the land and its peoples, instead became a shield against empathy. Fear, which might have inspired caution and restraint, instead fueled aggression. Together, they produced a story so persuasive that it would shape centuries of policy, culture, and memory. This was not faith at its best. It was faith pressed into service of survival at any cost. It was belief stripped of self-examination. It was religion used not to understand the world, but to conquer it. And once the lie took root, it did not remain confined to religion. It seeped into law, education, and national identity. It taught people to see themselves as chosen not because of their actions, but because of their existence. It made moral complexity inconvenient. It rewarded certainty over conscience. The tragedy is not only that this faith harmed others, but that it diminished those who wielded it. By denying the humanity of others, settlers narrowed their own. By equating God with domination, they transformed belief into burden. By refusing to question the lie, they passed it forward, intact and unchallenged, into the foundation of a nation still struggling to separate faith from fear, belief from entitlement, and survival from the stories it tells itself to avoid looking too closely at how it began. In the summer of 1619, a ship appeared on the horizon of Point Comfort in the English colony of Virginia. It was not the ship anyone had been waiting for. It carried no supplies promised by investors, no reinforcements to ease hunger or disease. It arrived quietly, almost unnoticed, and yet its presence would echo louder than cannon fire across centuries. On board were African men and women taken from their homes, carried across an ocean they did not choose, traded for provisions in a land that would later call itself the birthplace of freedom. No ceremony marked their arrival. No law yet defined their fate. There was no declaration announcing the beginning of something permanent, and yet something irreversible had begun. At first, the English colonists did not fully understand what they were creating. These Africans were listed alongside tools and livestock, exchanged as commodities rather than recognized as people. Some were treated similarly to indentured servants, their status ambiguous, their future uncertain. But ambiguity did not mean mercy. It meant opportunity for exploitation to harden before conscience could catch up. The colony was struggling. Tobacco demanded labor. Fields expanded faster than hands could tend them. European servants died quickly or demanded freedom after years of work. The economic pressure was relentless. And into that pressure stepped a brutal efficiency, lifetime bondage inherited by children, justified by difference, enforced by violence. Skin became a marker. Origin became a sentence. What followed was not an accident of history, but a series of choices made slowly, deliberately, and then defended fiercely. Laws were passed that drew lines where none had existed before. Africans were barred from bearing arms. Their testimony was restricted. Marriage across color was criminalized. Freedom, once possible in theory, became nearly unreachable in practice. By the time the word slavery appeared clearly in the law, the system was already mature. It had routines. It had profi. TS. It had defenders who claimed it was natural, necessary, even benevolent. And it had victims whose names were rarely written down, whose stories were carried instead in scars, songs, and silence. The paradox at the heart of America did not emerge later. It was present at the beginning. A society that spoke of liberty depended on unfreedom. A culture that praised independence relied on absolute dependence. The language of rights grew in the same soil as the practice of ownership. This contradiction did not weaken the colonies. It strengthened them. Plantations expanded across the South, generating wealth that flowed north and across the Atlantic. Banks financed human property. Insurance companies wrote policies on lives they would never see. Universities accepted donations earned through forced labor. Churches debated the morality of slavery while benefiting from its proceeds. Slavery was not a regional anomaly. It was a national engine. Those held in bondage were not passive participants in this system. They resisted in every way available to them. They ran when they could. They sabotaged quietly. They preserved languages and traditions under threat of punishment. They forged families and conditions designed to destroy them. They prayed to a God who seemed distant but necessary. Their resistance was constant, even when invisible. Fear shaped the response. Colonies passed harsher laws, not because enslaved people were content, but because they were not. Rebellions terrified slaveholders, exposing the lie that domination produced peace. Every uprising was met with public executions, new restrictions, renewed insistence that control was survival. The enslaved were portrayed as dangerous precisely because they were human. As generations passed, slavery embedded itself deeper into American life. Children were born into chains without ever having seen the ocean that brought their ancestors. Families were separated without explanation. Bodies were valued more for their output than their existence. Violence became routine, regulated, almost bureaucratic. And yet, alongside this cruelty, the colonies began to imagine themselves as champions of freedom. They complained of British tyranny. They protested taxation without representation. They spoke eloquently about natural rights and the dignity of the individual. These ideas were not hollow, they were powerful. They would inspire revolutions across the world, but they were also selectively applied when independence came. It did not resolve the contradiction, it formalized it. The new nation declared that liberty was universal while ensuring that millions would never touch it. The Constitution protected slavery without naming it, cloaking injustice in legal caution. Compromise was praised as wisdom, even when it postponed suffering rather than prevented it. Freedom and bondage were bound together at birth. The enslaved heard the words of the revolution and understood their meaning better than most. They petitioned for freedom using the language of natural rights. They fought in wars that promised liberty and delivered disappointment. They watched as a nation argued over the definition of equality while denying their humanity outright. This tension did not fade with time. It sharpened. Slavery shaped not only economics, but identity. Whiteness became a form of social currency, ing status to those who owned nothing else. Poor Europeans were taught to see themselves as superior to enslaved Africans, binding them emotionally to a system that exploited them as well. Division was enforced not only by law, but by narrative. The idea took hold that freedom was fragile, that it could only exist if others were constrained. Liberty was reframed not as shared dignity, but as a limited resource to be guarded. Religion adapted. Scripture was twisted to defend bondage. Pulpits echoed with claims that slavery was divinely ordained. God was recruited once again to quiet doubt, to soothe consciences that might otherwise rebel. Still, cracks appeared. Voices rose against the system, some whispering, some shouting. Enslaved people escaped and told their stories. Abolitionists circulated pamphlets that named cruelty plainly. Former slaves spoke with moral authority that could not be ignored. Each story exposed the lie that slavery was humane, stable, or necessary. But exposure did not equal immediate change. The system was too profitable, too ingrained, too protected by law and custom. It would take war to tear it apart, and even that would not fully end its influence. The legacy of 1619 did not conclude with emancipation. It shifted forms. Black freedom was met with black codes, then segregation, then mass incarceration. The language changed. The hierarchy remained. The contradiction endured. To say that slavery was central to America's origins is not to deny the power of its ideals. It is to understand the cost at which they were articulated. Liberty was not born cleanly. It was compromised from the start. And the people who paid for that compromise were those whose labor built the nation without granting them a stake in its promises. The arrival of those first Africans did not merely add another chapter to American history. It defined the terms of the story that followed. A nation would spend centuries trying to reconcile the words it spoke with the reality it enforced, the freedom it celebrated with the bondage it normalized, the belief that all men are created equal with the practice of deciding again and again who counted as a man at all. When the colonies broke from Britain, they did so not as a united moral force, but as a fragile coalition bound by shared grievance and mutual suspicion. Independence was not inevitable, and it was not pure. It was negotiated, argued, delayed, and shaped by fear. Fear that the revolution would collapse from within before it could defeat an empire from without. The men who gathered to imagine a new nation understood something essential. Unity was more valuable than justice, at least for the moment. They spoke passionately about liberty. They wrote soaring words about natural rights and the consent of the governed. They believed sincerely that power concentrated in the hands of a distant authority was dangerous. Yet many of them exercised absolute power over others in their own homes. This was not a contradiction they failed to notice. It was one they chose to manage. Slavery stood at the center of that choice. By the late 18th century, the institution was deeply embedded in the social and economic fabric of the colonies. Southern economies depended on it. Northern economies benefited from it. Shipping, banking, insurance, and manufacturing were tied directly or indirectly. Why? To enslaved labor. To challenge slavery outright would have threatened the alliance necessary for independence, and so it was postponed. The language of the revolution allowed this delay. Freedom was framed as a collective struggle against external tyranny, not an internal reckoning. Equality was described as an ideal rather than an obligation. The most radical implications of these ideas were quietly contained so the cause could survive. When the Constitution was drafted, this containment became formal. The document that would govern the nation was not written to perfect justice, but to prevent collapse. Every clause reflected anxiety about rebellion, about faction, about the fragility of the Union itself. Slavery haunted the room even when it went unnamed. It shaped debates over representation, taxation, and federal power. It forced compromises that were praised as pragmatic and condemned as cowardly. Often at the same time, enslaved people were counted for representation but denied rights. This mathematical abstraction transformed human beings into political leverage. States that enslaved more people gained more power, not because they honored freedom, but because they violated it efficiently. The contradiction was embedded in the structure of governance, disguised as balance. The founders told themselves this was temporary. That time would soften the injustice. That future generations, wiser and less dependent on compromise, would resolve what they could not. This belief allowed them to move forward without resolving the moral crisis at the heart of their work. Some wrestled with this choice more openly than others. Private letters revealed doubt, guilt, and unease. But public action rarely matched private reflection. The fear of disunion outweighed the call of conscience. A fractured nation, they believed, would doom liberty altogether. Better to accept injustice than risk chaos. This logic became a habit. By refusing to confront slavery at the nation's founding, the United States transformed a moral failure into a political tradition. Each generation inherited not only the problem, but the precedent of delay. Compromise became a virtue, even when it preserved suffering. Moderation was praised, even when it meant tolerating cruelty. The language of freedom expanded, but its application remained selective. Citizenship was defined narrowly. Voting rights were restricted. Power was concentrated among those who already possessed it. The revolution changed who ruled, but not who counted. This selective application required storytelling. The nation began to narrate its founding as heroic and unified, smoothing over disagreements and erasing the voices excluded from the room. The founders were elevated into symbols rather than examined as men shaped by their circumstances and their fears. The Constitution was treated as sacred text rather than contested compromise. In the story, slavery became a footnote rather than a foundation. But the consequences of that compromise did not remain abstract. They shaped every major conflict that followed. As the nation expanded, the question of whether new territories would permit slavery reignited the same fear of fracture that had haunted the founders. Each debate echoed the original bargain: preserve the Union first, address injustice later. Later never came easily. The Constitution's silence on slavery did not make it neutral. It protected the institution by default. Federal power was constrained from interfering. States were allowed to define humanity according to local interest. Fugitive slave laws extended bondage beyond state lines, forcing free states into complicity. The machinery of government enforced a system it refused to name. Those enslaved understood this betrayal more clearly than anyone. They lived within a nation that proclaimed liberty while denying their personhood. They heard the language of rights and recognized its meaning even as it excluded them. They appealed to the Constitution not as it was written, but as it claimed to be. Their appeals were often ignored. The moral cost of the founding compromise accumulated quietly. It shaped political culture, teaching leaders to prize stability over justice. It rewarded caution even when urgency was required. It taught the nation to see inequality as unfortunate but tolerable, tragic but manageable. This mindset delayed confrontation until delay was no longer possible. When Civil War finally came, it was not an aberration. It was the unpaid debt of the founding. The compromises that once held the nation together now tore it apart. The Constitution that had preserved unity became a battlefield over interpretation and intent. The question the founders postponed returned with violence. Even after slavery was abolished, the habits formed at the founding persisted. Equality remained conditional. Rights were contested. The federal government hesitated to enforce justice when it threatened local power. Reconstruction faltered under the weight of old compromises, reborn as new excuses. The nation had freed the enslaved, but not fully abandoned the logic that had enslaved them. To understand the origins of the United States is to see the founding not as a moment of moral clarity, but as a moment of moral deferral. The Revolution created possibility without guaranteeing outcome. The Constitution established order without ensuring equity. The promise was vast, but it was fenced in by fear. The men who built the nation believed they were buying time. What they purchased instead was inheritance, an inheritance of unresolved contradiction. passed forward with each generation tasked to decide whether to honor the promise or repeat the compromise, whether to complete the work or continue postponing it, whether to treat unity as an excuse or justice as a responsibility embedded in the very foundation they chose to leave unfinished. Expansion did not begin as a theory. It began as hunger. Hunger for land, for security, for wealth, for distance from the fears that haunted the eastern settlements. As the young nation stabilized its independence, its gaze turned westward toward territories described as open, unsettled, waiting. The language mattered. To call land empty was to make its taking inevitable. To call movement destiny was to remove choice from the equation. What followed was not a spontaneous migration of families seeking opportunity. It was a coordinated project of acquisition, backed by policy, protected by force, and justified by story. The United States did not simply grow, it advanced deliberately and often violently into lands already lived on, governed, farmed, and revered by native nations who had survived there for generations beyond counting. The idea that this expansion was natural, almost biological, was carefully cultivated. Newspapers, politicians, and preachers spoke of progress as if it were weather, unstoppable and morally neutral. Roads, railways, and towns appeared as symbols of civilization, while the disappearance of native communities was treated as unfortunate but unavoidable. The cost was acknowledged only vaguely, if at all. Behind this language were policies designed to clear the way. Treaties multiplied, each one promising peace and permanence, each one vulnerable to the same fate. When land became valuable, agreements were revised. When resistance emerged, terms were reinterpreted. When negotiation failed, removal followed. Law was not an alternative to force, it was often its preparation. Removal was framed as mercy. Native nations were told they would be safer elsewhere, beyond the reach of settlers they could no longer resist. Entire communities were uprooted and marched across unfamiliar terrain, carrying what they could, leaving behind graves, homes, and histories. The journeys were brutal. Disease spread. Supplies ran out. Elders collapsed. Children died. The land they were sent to was often barren, already claimed, or temporary by design. This was not a failure of policy, it was its function. The government recorded these removals in documents that spoke of relocation and resettlement. Rarely did they mention grief. Rarely did they describe the sound of families breaking apart, or the silence that followed when villages were emptied. The bureaucratic language allowed distance, turning suffering into statistics. As settlers moved west, they encountered resistance and interpreted it as hostility rather than survival. When native nations defended their land, it confirmed the narrative that they were obstacles to progress. Military campaigns followed, some brief, others drawn out and devastating. Victory was measured not only in battles won, but in territory secured. Even when native communities attempted adaptation, it did not guarantee safety. Those who adopted European farming methods, legal systems, and education were still removed when their land became desirable. Assimilation did not protect them because the goal was never coexistence. It was possession. The land itself became a symbol of national virtue. To cultivate it was to claim moral superiority. To fence it was to civilize it. Indigenous relationships to land, spiritual, communal, cyclical, were dismissed as inefficient, even immoral. A worldview that did not prioritize ownership was treated as proof of backwardness. This logic reshaped the American identity. The pioneer became a hero. Hardship became evidence of character. Violence became regrettable but necessary. Those displaced faded into the background of the story, present only as shadows or threats. Expansion also reinforced racial hierarchy. As native nations were pushed aside, whiteness became increasingly associated with belonging and entitlement. The land was framed as a reward for those deemed worthy, and worthiness was defined narrowly. Others could labor on it, but not claim it. Others could die on it, but not define it. The doctrine that eventually came to be known as manifest destiny did not introduce these ideas. It organized them. It gave moral clarity to ambition and spiritual cover to greed. It told Americans that Scion was not just beneficial but ordained, that resistance was not just inconvenient but wrong. Once sanctified, expansion could accelerate without restraint. The consequences extended beyond native nations. The relentless push west intensified conflicts over slavery, as each new territory reopened the question of who would be free and who would be bound. Expansion multiplied contradictions rather than resolving them. spreading the nation's unresolved moral questions across a wider landscape. Yet the national narrative rarely paused to reflect. Each new acquisition was celebrated as growth. Each new displacement was absorbed into silence. Progress moved forward, leaving behind fractured nations and renamed places, their original meanings stripped away. Even after the frontier officially closed, the effects of displacement endured. Native communities were confined to reservations, often on land unsuitable for sustaining life as they had known it. Promises of support were inconsistently kept. Autonomy was restricted. Children were sent to boarding schools where their languages and identities were systematically erased in the name of integration. These policies were described as benevolent. They were experienced as erasure. Despite this, Native nations survived. They adapted again, preserving culture under pressure, memory under threat. Their survival challenged the myth that expansion was total and final, but recognition came slowly, if at all. Their stories remained peripheral to the national consciousness. The land bore witness to all of it. Rivers diverted, forests cleared, sacred sites paved over. The physical transformation mirrored the moral one. Expansion reshaped not only geography, but the nation's relationship to consequence. Taking became normalized. Displacement became invisible. To look closely at this history is to see that progress was never free. Every mile gained had a cost measured in loss that did not appear on balance sheets. The nation moved forward by deciding repeatedly that some lives mattered less than momentum, that some histories could be discarded without consequence, that the future justified the removal of the present. This pattern did not end with the 19th century. It echoed in later policies, later conflicts, later justifications for intervention and control. The logic of expansion, of believing that power confers righteousness, that growth excuses harm, remained intact, repurposed for new contexts. The forgotten origins of this movement are not forgotten because they are obscure. They are forgotten because they are inconvenient. They challenge the comfort of a story that celebrates achievement without reckoning with cost. They complicate pride with responsibility. The land that became the United States was not empty when the nation began moving across it, and it did not consent to the stories told about its taking. Beneath highways and cities lie traces of paths walked under guard, of homes burned to make room, of names spoken quietly so they would not disappear, of nations that were never meant to vanish and did not, despite every effort to ensure they would, despite centuries of policy designed to push them out of sight, despite a national memory that prefers movement to mourning, progress to pause, destiny to accountability, and a future imagined without fully acknowledging who was asked to step aside so that future could be claimed. Thanks for watching this video, and don't forget to like and subscribe.